Well, good evening, everybody. Welcome. Good to see you all. We've been talking for 10 weeks on the stuff that the thoughts were inspired, let's say, by listening to Joel Goldsmith's Living Between Two Worlds tapes. And I was very clearly led to listen to those and do some talks there. And presumably that was because that's where most of us are working and where we are, keeping the mud, head in the clouds. So, and it was confirmed because Dulcie also was led to the same tapes for her retreats, the one that she held and the one she's going to hold in a couple of weeks. So, but it was just as clear to me after last Tuesday night that that's done. And so we're not doing that anymore, unless, of course, anybody wants to ask any questions about that or bring up any questions that have come up about that stuff. This is very informal. Raise hands, ask questions, jump in, ask, about anything, really. Seems like that was sort of foundation work. It was taught by Joel in 1964, and all that information has been pumped into human consciousness now for 40 years since then. So we get it a lot easier than they did, and can go further than they did. Because Joel, after talking about all that stuff, sort of, lines up still with, giving advice about how to be in the big eye instead of the little eye. And that's what we talked about. But the question, the game is to not play between the big eye and the little eye. Big eye being the spiritual self, little eye being the personal sense. The part of us that thinks it's human. The quick way, and Robert's answer would be, why do we play there at all? There is no human being. There is no body. There is no mind. We have a case of false identification where the God consciousness that we are has misidentified and thinks that it's this body-mind phenomenon. And instead of worrying about becoming desireless, or instead of worrying about overcoming our fears, or instead of worrying about tearing up our scripts, or instead of worrying about raising our kid, or instead of worrying about getting rid of our wants, or instead of worrying about having a better life, or instead of worrying about the state of the world, or instead of worrying about any of these things, or actively working towards any of these goals, why not just ask who it is that's worrying about all this stuff, or acting towards all these goals, or trying to accomplish all these things? That person doesn't exist. That one that thinks he or she should become desireless doesn't exist. The one who thinks they should become more loving doesn't exist. The one who wants to become a good parent or a good child doesn't exist. The one who wants to save the world doesn't exist. The one who wants to become enlightened doesn't exist. All of this stuff is predicated on the misidentification that with the personal I. And the personal I doesn't exist. There is no body, there is no mind. That's all the human consciousness concepts. And human consciousness doesn't exist. Of course, the problem is that leaves us in the place where there's no valid platform from which to ask any questions, because the one that wants to ask the question, of course, is this misidentification. But that's okay, we can ask questions. But what needs to be accomplished first in this process is disidentifying with the personal sense of I. Moving back a step from this absolute belief that we're the body-mind to initially to the position of the witness, of a witness of the body-mind. And we need to be a little careful here because there's a handful of witnesses around. It's easy for me to witness myself, to witness my body, witness my mind, but that's not the witness I'm talking about, because if I'm witnessing myself, the mere fact that I say I'm witnessing myself or my body or my mind means that this witness is part of the personal I. This is the personal I kidding itself, is taking a step back and looking at itself. But there is a dispassionate witness. There's a huge difference between whether I witness myself sitting here talking or I witness that body there, the Lee body, talking. In the first case, I think I'm talking and I think I have to worry about what I'm going to say and blah, blah, blah. In the second case, I'm quite curious as to what he's going to say next, because nobody knows what Lee's going to say next. Lee certainly doesn't have any idea what he's going to say next, and the dispassionate witness has no idea what's going to be said next and no interest in what's said next. And if I'm identified there, there's nothing different, because Lee is still going to say whatever the hell it is that Lee's going to say, and Lee's going to say the same thing whether I'm identified with Lee and worried about it, or whether I'm identified with the dispassionate witness and watching it happen. That makes absolutely no difference. What's going to be said here is going to be said. But if I'm identified with Lee, then I have all the human stuff going on, I can be worried about whether it's the right thing or the wrong thing, and I worry about this and that, and all the duality and all the turmoil and all the suffering that Buddha says is associated with being a personal I. And if I'm the dispassionate one watching Lee talk, then it's with no interest. At most, there's mild curiosity. And there's going to be no ruffles, and if Lee didn't say anything starting right now, for the rest of the entire talk, it would make no difference at all. This one would be exactly the same whether Lee keeps talking or not. And so would your witness be if you were witnessing, if you're personally identified. And some of you, if I were to stop talking, would be sitting there thinking, when's he going to talk some more? And others of you would be thinking, I hope he doesn't talk anymore. And all of you would have waves and muddle going on in your mind. But the point I'm trying to make is that the first step in the process of discovering who you are is to stop the false identification, because as long as you think you're the body and mind, you will not possibly discover who you really are. And who you really are is so much more wonderful than the body and the mind, but it seems a shame that we insist on befuddling ourselves with this silly idea that we're the body and the mind. And any reasonable amount of investigation personal investigation will reveal to you that you are not the body and you are not the mind. First of all, is my body and my mind. Whose body and whose mind? So even instinctively I know that I'm not the body and the mind. They're things I have. Second of all, if you look at the mind, you will very quickly discover that there's nothing there except conglomeration of thoughts. There's a little bit of memory there, and there's the thought going on currently, and there's the illusion of an entity called the mind in that sense of the word, which is created by the fact that the thoughts happen so fast and so repetitively and don't ever give a gap that we think there's some continuity going on there. But in fact, there's just thoughts happening, and now it's here and now it's not. And thoughts are in the now, and some thoughts in the now are about now, and some thoughts in the now are about the past, and we call those memories, but they're not memories, they're just thoughts now about past stories. And but the idea that we think it's in the memory about us maintains the illusion that there's an us. And we have thoughts about the future, which just means that having made the error of thinking that the memories are about me in the past, I now project the future. There's nothing to sustain the idea of this time flowing through the thoughts and having a continuous identity that is that train. And similarly, if you were to take an electron microscope to your body, you would discover that it's made up of a bunch of atoms with huge spaces between the atoms. And the atoms, which are tiny compared to this vast space, are made up of a nucleus and electrons. And in fact, there are vast spaces within the atom between the nucleus and the electrons. So we're 99 point, I don't know how many nines percent space. And even the little tiny bits, the electrons that might be real, aren't. I mean, physical science, material science will tell you that the electrons are more wave-like than particle-like, and that most of their probabilities about where they'll be, and the only way for an electron to exist in any particular place is to be seen there. It requires seeing it, and in fact, this is just the truth that what we see is what we're generating, that we're generating this whole thing, and things are where we see them. The seeing is the creation, not the observation. So there's really no case to make for there even being a body. And it's very interesting as science gets more and more sophisticated, they more and more prove what the rishis have known for 5,000 years, that there is no body. The space between the atoms and the space between the subatomic particles is called consciousness. Consciousness is space. Consciousness is mind. In this sense, the externalization of consciousness is in mind is this thing that we claim as reality. So the first step is to disidentify, get back to I am. I am is true. I am is an experience that we all have individually, and it's a fact. Now, if you add any other word to that, it's no longer true. And if you think you know what the I is that I am, you're wrong. But I am is the truth. And you can make great progress on discovering who we really are by investigating, by disidentifying with the body, and by investigating I am and discovering what I am isn't. We can't discover what I am is, but we can discover what I am isn't. As we disidentify with the body and mind, the desires drop and the fears drop, and all that stuff drops, and the mind gets quieter and quieter. And as we disidentify with any of the lies that we have created about who I am or what I am, the mind gets quieter and quieter. As we withdraw all of our energy, which means our interest, from what's going on in our mind, the mind gets quieter and quieter. And when the mind is truly quiet, it's obvious. There it is. Here it is. Right now. All there is. Right here. Right now.
What if right now sucks? I'm just kidding. But
then you're not here right now.
So how, if you're in the right now,
You're not in the right now.
I know.
No, one is never in the right now. One being.
Right now, just one time.
Now, I can't be in the right now because there's either an I or there's a right now.
So, how come what you were just saying, it's a, you're clear and da-da-da, and there's all this is, why do I have to do so much work? Now I understand the context. Why does the little I have to do so much work and realize it doesn't exist, which you can't even realize realization, and then everything all is well, and then you come crashing back to the planet?
Well, the little I doesn't have to do all that work. We have to do spiritual practice until we get focused enough to be able to do some work. We have to do this at Hana. But the purpose of all the spiritual work is to bring your mind to a point where it's one-pointed. Because when it's one-pointed, then you can withdraw your energy from that point and be in the silence. And when you're in the silence, you're in the truth. So, the amount of work you have to do is I was going to say it depends on how hard it is for you to withdraw your energy from your thoughts. But the real answer is that the problem is you're interested in all this stuff. The problem is that you're interested in the stuff that you have. You have all this stuff that you want, and you have all this stuff that you don't want, and the stuff you'd like to have happen in your life, and the stuff you don't want to happen in your life, and all this sort of stuff. And you not only are identifying with the personal self, but you're very interested in its welfare, and this interest is keeping you there. Even desiring to become enlightened keeps you tied and prevented, because I can't be enlightened.
Right.
There's either enlightenment or there's me. And if there's no me, all there is enlightenment. That's the kicker. If there's no me, it's done. And there isn't any me on top of that. If there were no me, everyone would be enlightened, and there isn't any me. So guess what? Everybody is enlightened right now. But there's this confusion because of this misidentification, because you're interested.
I believe I was listening to a Robert Adams CD from December of '92, and it was one of the first or the second. I haven't listened to many, and he mentioned briefly something that he indicated he talked about a lot, and that was self-inquiry.
Yes.
And also self-surrendering.
Yes.
And I tried to grab onto it and hold it, but I'm still hoping that I could hear more about it.
Wonderful tools. All right, self-inquiry is the fastest technique there is for disassociating yourself with the personal sense, and that's what we're talking about tonight. That's his tool for doing this. And self-inquiry is just very simply, whenever a thought occurs to you, ask, who does it occur to? Rather than getting caught up in the thought. A thought comes in, you can either go vertical with the thought and say, oh wow, that's nice, oh wow, that's scary, oh gosh, I don't want that, or I hope I get, you can go vertical, and vertical means bring your emotion up rather than not touching to it. And, or you can inquire, who's thinking this thought, who does this thought come to? Which immediately disassociates you from the thought. Now you're looking at the one who was the personal I. You're looking at the personal I who was about to get caught up in it. Okay? It's the step back from that. So you would ask, to carry it through in his usual way, you would ask, to whom does this thought come? And perhaps something in your head, most people, at least initially, something in their head will say, comes to me. And then the question is, well, who is this me? And where did this me come from? And you look at the me. You focus on, look at the me, ask, where did this me come from? What's the source of this me? If this me exists, where did it come from? Who is this me? And you ask the question, who is this me? Where did this me come from? But don't answer it. Look. Be attentive. And in that moment, there will be some silence. That will put you immediately in the silence. Then, of course, the minute your head starts up again, your head will say, well, we're in the silence. And you say, to whom does this thought come? And you ask the question again. And if you this process, the gaps between the thoughts will spread, and the depth of the silence will grow. And so it's a long-term, it's an ongoing practice that you do. I did that for a considerable period of time when I was with him the first 2 or 3 years. And I don't know, after doing it a lot, I drove to Hollywood or Woodland Hills or somewhere 3 times a week and back. And so I practiced that all the way out and all the way back. And often they were 1.5 or 2-hour drives, to get across town at 6 o'clock to go to Hollywood Hills. And I would practice it every time I drove there and back. And it probably wasn't more than 3 or 4 months before I got to where I would just, the thought would happen and I would say, who? And I'd drop into the silence, just like that. Okay? It figured so far the other way that just the word who had been bound to pat you on it. It was so clear that there was no answer, that there was nobody there. Nobody was going to raise their hand ever. That it would drop me into the silence. It's also a useful tool at the other level if you find yourself emotional about something. Rather than trying to solve the problem, ask who's emotional. If you find yourself in a jam, rather than trying to resolve the jam, ask who's in a jam. Who thinks they're in a jam? If you find yourself depressed, ask yourself who's depressed. You see, in each case, it backs the question away, because in all those cases, it's not you that's in a jam, it's not you that has a problem, it's not you that's depressed, it's the little I. It appears to have those attributes associated with it in this moment. I mean, it doesn't exist, but the picture we have of the little I has the attribute of depressed or happy or in trouble or lonesome or miserable, or, and any emotion that comes to you, you can ask the question, to whom does this come? Which is a back off. That's a perfectly valid use of the word transcendence. That transcends the problem, because now you're above it and back of it looking at it. And you're not even addressing the problem, which you don't want to address, because addressing the problem sustains the I. So that's self-inquiry. Some people are not mature enough spiritually to do self-inquiry. Some people discover that they feel really foolish doing self-inquiry, or some part of them keeps cranking up, saying, "Oh, this will never work," or "What a silly game," or "This has no meaning," and they can talk themselves out of doing it, and they find that they're not yet ready to sustain an effort at doing self-inquiry. And it's, an effort not unlike doing a mantra, although it's not a 24/7 thing, but whenever you can, you like to do it.
It does seem difficult.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but you have to develop the habit. Yeah, like I said, I started doing it in the car when there's nothing else to do anyway. But you can do it always. It turns out, you can do it while you're at work.
Can you also apply it to actions and physical actions and feelings?
Sure, certainly feelings especially, but there's no reason, although I had never heard about it or talked about it, no reason why you couldn't ask who's running. But the answer to that is the answer to the action that I just got. The answer to asking the question about an action is the answer is the body. And that's not what we're trying to do. What we're trying to do is find the source of the I.
So I misunderstood something.
Any event, the people who have difficulty doing self-inquiry, Robert suggested, another perfectly good way to do is surrender. But he means surrender absolutely everything about yourself. Give up any, thy will, not mine, with respect to everything. Lose all interest in everything about it. And I can't talk a lot about surrender because that wasn't my path. My path is the jnana path, and that's the bhakti path. And I don't have any experience with their surrender. It was never one of my long streaks. So I don't know about the surrender, but he's talking about completely surrendering, giving up any sense of your own will, and you can see where it would lead to the same thing, because if you have no sense of trying to accomplish your will, but you're just docilely going along with whatever is happening as God's will, then that certainly diminishes your identification with the personal sense, because it relates to stopping thinking that you're the doer and watching it being done through that body that you used to claim. So that's the other path. Robert had devotees that were of the jnana marga path. The jnana means knowledge. The knowledge path, and he had others that were of the bhakti path and devotional path, and so he taught them both, and they both lead to the same place, he says. My nature is very Adhyani, and they are bhakti. So is that?
What is bhakti?
Devotion.
Jnani's knowledge.
Jnani's knowledge.
What is devotion?
love. There are people who have there's really four major yogas. There's Jnana Yoga, which is the path of knowledge. There's Bhakti Yoga, which is the path of devotion. And usually, what you do is what people do in India is pick the god, their favorite god, who they're very devoted to, and work towards becoming rapturous towards that god, keeping the name and form in their mind at all times, and praying and becoming more and more devoted. And of course, they lose themselves in that devotion to the god. And at some point, you discover that it's you, and you've gone to the top that way. The third yoga is karma yoga. It's the path of action, active people. And an example of that is to do everything as if it were a service to God. And so you do everything you do with the attention to detail and the respect and the skill that you would bring to doing it if you were doing it for God. And you take no responsibility or interest in the outcome. The Zen Master story about the Zen Master who had his disciples build him a hut. And when he did, he came over and looked at it and said, "Take it apart." And so they took it apart, and when it was all apart and completely clean and the ground looking perfectly natural again, he asked him to build him a hut. Okay? Karma yoga. And the fourth yoga is Raja Yoga, the way of the path of kings. And that's the one that focuses on meditation and the eightfold path of this and the yamas and the niyamas and the this and the that and all the various formal things in yoga. And I don't know anything about that path at all.
So what about Dharma?
Dharma is not a path, it's the fact. Dharma is what's happening to you. Your Dharma is what's happening.
And karma? Karma?
Karma. Another word for as you sow, so shall you reap, or another word for destiny. And of course, the immediate question is who has karma? Who has Dharma? If you're Robert, you would say, who has karma? To whom does this karma come?
My bed got stolen out of my garage. So I asked my neighbor, "Did you accidentally take my bed?" And he goes, "Well, I'll ask my roommate," because they moved. Then his roommate showed up at my door today and said, "Hey, we accidentally took your bed." And I said, "Oh, well, just keep it." Mm-hmm. So it was like kind of just a weird experience.
So self-inquiry is the direct path because it gets rid of the personal sense of I, and it is the personal sense of I that has attached to it everything else. Everything that we think about is I do this, or I think this, or I feel this, or I'm sick, or I'm well, or I'm rich, or I'm poor, or I'm smart, or I'm dumb, or I'm here, or I'm there, or, everything about our experience is attached to the little I. And rather than address the leaves on the tree, it's easy to take the axe to the root. So self-inquiry is...
God is consciousness.
God is consciousness, yes.
And how does this all fit into... I work with somebody who is a Christian. Mm-hmm. And as far as... I think that if he were sitting here, he would not listen to this because it's so totally against his concept of what God is and Jesus Christ and all of that. So how does that fit in?
Well, it would not bother Jesus at all to sit here.
Can I say something? Go ahead.
Just a second. If Jesus and Buddha were sitting in the same room and Buddha were talking and Jesus were talking, they'd both be saying, yeah, listen to him, he's right. Truth is the same. The Christian church's interpretation of what Jesus said is so wide of the mark. Jesus was clearly an enlightened master. Like Buddha, like Lao Tzu, like one of the incredible lights. One of the 5, let's say, clearest lights that have been on this planet in 5,000 years. And there's very little question about the truth he says, and if you understand what he says, it's very clear. What he says in the gospel is very clear, and there's absolutely nothing that Jesus says that's inconsistent with anything that Robert says, or Ramana Maharshi, or Sarvadata Maharaj, but they're radically inconsistent with the Christian teaching, especially of political institutions like the Catholic Church, who have an obligation to maintain a priest class and maintain a political situation and maintain property and possessions and stuff that they have the obligation to do. And
So their interpretation of Christ.
Well, I'm a Christian, and when he was saying the 4 things, like the action and the people that go towards what is one of the gods, and then he explained gods, Jesus was all that. And then when he said that you do all this towards God and then you realize you are God, well, the Holy Spirit is God, and that's me. And I start all my meditations, I come to you as a servant to Jesus Christ. And Jesus is my master, but none of these teachings interfere with that. But if I was a closed-minded Christian, it could not be effective. But I'm a very studied Christian. That's what the Bible says at all.
yeah, Jesus was magnificent, and one of my favorite. There's some wonderful books about Jesus and his teaching by Rajneesh, and there's a wonderful book on the Sermon on the Mount by Prabhupada, and these are various teachers in other schools who discuss and discourse on Jesus' teaching with great clarity and great love, and find no problem with them at all. For a teaching to be true, for anyone to be able to teach anyone, they have to have the realization, not the knowledge. If I have the knowledge of what Jesus said, but I haven't had any realization about it, then my knowledge is my knowledge, and it's limited by my understanding, and that's limited by my conditioning and by all sorts of things, and I don't have any understanding. Buddha died, and the next day there were 16 sects of Buddhism. Okay? Because there were 16 fairly advanced disciples who had not yet attained, who thought they knew what Buddha was saying. Okay? And there was also the Zen Buddhism, where the disciple who began Zen had realized. And so the Zen path was the live path. And Zen is still alive today because it is passed down from teacher to disciple, or from master to student, and the students become masters, or they don't teach. And so the only way you're going to get a clear understanding is from somebody who has had a realization as distinct to an education. And there are quite a few very valid Christian teachings. Some of the saints really had full-on realizations. That's really what the Christian church means by a saint. It is one who's had a realization, who's had a spiritual experience. But it doesn't require a realization to become the Pope.
Right.
And yet, the Pope makes decrees ex cathedra, and when he makes them ex cathedra, they're infallibly the Word of God, and he better be in realization where he says them, or the Church is going to wind up for the next 500 years trying to overcome the fact that a Pope ex cathedra decided you shouldn't eat fish on Friday or whatever else what he decided, That particular injunction is not ex cathedra, but there are a lot of really stupid things that were said ex cathedra that they're still trying to live with today.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what happens if there's not realization. So
But I wouldn't discuss this.
Christian mystics would have no trouble at all with what I say. And I've had several people tell me I'm the most Christian man they know. And none of that's in conflict with this, but it certainly is not. And it's also quite consistent with a lot of the stuff certainly with Goldsmith. It's completely consistent with Goldsmith and with the Christian Science and Church Religious Science and those types of Christianity. It's the Orthodox Christians that are going to have trouble with this.
Mm-hmm.
And they're not here. Or they won't come back.
And that would apply to Judaism or any one of the other faiths, because it all comes back down to spirituality.
Sure. The Hasidic Jews have some real light. And the Sufis are the living sect of the Mohammedan tradition. Okay? The Sufis have had some real light and have passed it on from master to disciple. And Zen is the real Buddhist church. And there isn't I guess, Mary Baker Eddy really had a pretty clear realization, although it wasn't a complete knock your socks off type, but a pretty clear one. And so did Joel. So there's the non-Orthodox Christian churches are certainly much closer. They had some. Mary Baker Eddy's realization was a realization. It was not an intellectualization. And Joel Goldsmith was certainly a total revelation. So that happened, and John of the Cross, and Sister Teresa, many of them have had real experiences.
Does the plant over there exist, or is that something that's created?
Created by what?
By the eye. I mean, does the eye create the environment as it is? Nothing really exists. The chair, the ottoman,
everything is an appearance in consciousness. There is nothing other than consciousness. Consciousness is self-illuminated and self-contained, and that's all there is. And everything is an appearance in consciousness. And we use God and consciousness interchangeably. And neither is the ultimate state. But it's pretty darn close. But there is awareness above that. Just pure awareness. Consciousness is within awareness. And awareness is the state that, for instance, Robert talks from, or Nisargadatta Maharaj, or Ramana Maharshi, Papa Ram Das, and Karoli Baba. All those people were very clear.
We all see the plant because we're all in the same state of eye.
Well, you are clinging to the belief that there's a we all. See, that question is based on the premise that there are separate individuals. There's not even a we all.
Okay.
And it's not a plant. If you were having a dream right now, you were dreaming that you could dream that you were in this room, and you could dream that there was the plant, and you could dream that we're all sitting here looking at the plant, talking about how lovely the plant is. And yet that entire creation is in your dream. Okay? And this is no different. It has exactly the reality of that that dream would have. Appearance in consciousness that seems to respond. We think this is so very real because it speaks to all five senses, okay? And we tend to think, movies only speak to sound and sight. And, we're convinced that if there's touch, that makes it real, right? And in fact, the one who has the five senses is part of the dream, okay? So not only is the touch part of the dream, but the sense of touch and the one who is capable of sensing touch is also part of the dream. It's all part of the dream. There's nothing outside of it. See, all there is consciousness, and consciousness does not have those five senses. It's all part of the dream of having material reality. The five senses come with the dream of having this material physical body.
And no one dies because they didn't exist to begin with.
Never born, never died. It's as if Joel Goldsmith would say that God is consciousness, expressing itself as individual consciousnesses, okay? But each individual consciousness is one with the one, and is really all of the one. And in this sense, Jesus is the only Son of God, okay? Because Jesus is one with God. As Jesus said, I and my Father are one. And Jesus also said, you see me, you're seeing the Father. Jesus is acknowledging that that's who it is. What he's doing when he's saying that stuff is not claiming anything unique about his physical body. He's denying the physical body. If you believe in me, you believe in a lie, he said. If you believe in this, you believe in a lie. So Jesus is real clear about all of this. And so there's the individual expression of consciousness, and there's these, and words don't work quite right, but there's these identities within consciousness. But the physical body is like a projection of that consciousness in mind. Where you think of mind as like the screen at the movie theater that the movie is shown on. This body is a reflection of the corresponding individualization of God consciousness in mind, is the way that Joel would talk about it, and that's about as reasonable a way to talk about it if you're going to talk about it.
It's kind of like the body of Christ would be all the individual consciousnesses as one, which is God.
Yeah. If you use the word Christ as Christ consciousness, that's all the consciousnesses, and the body of Christ is the universe.
Right, exactly. And that's what he said.
Or alternatively, you could say that God's body is the universe.
Right.
But it's not the physical universe. It's not the material universe.
And that's what he was saying.
The material universe is the material entity's concept of whatever it is that level is.
So why don't we just eat a bunch of spaghetti and go to sleep every day?
Go for it.
I do.
I don't know why you don't. Can't imagine why you don't.
It came out from over there.
Absolutely no reason at all.
I appreciate, I'm sorry, I don't know your name. Lynn, Kathy, you bring that whole Christian thing, because I'm a devout Christian, but I also happen to, and then you brought up Catholicism, and I practice and I have Catholic faith, and it's funny because when I first got into this stuff, I had this little bit of tug of, it's just a contradiction to what I believe. And it was funny because when I've been fully devoted to Catholicism, and I had an experience in college where I was attacked by a lot of Oregon Christians, And it was funny because I knew there were things that didn't gel in terms of Catholicism, and the things they were saying, I'm like, it was just so unjust. I'm like, God is not unjust. Yeah. So it's like, you know, it was like I was understanding things that they said there and believed it, yet I had my own Catholic beliefs. And the funniest thing is, the more I've done this has strengthened.
Oh, yeah.
Spiritually, I think, more than anything. And one of the things that you said, that don't do it because I said so. Do it because you experience it.
Yeah.
And there's so many things in my life that I've done because, well, my mom said you're supposed to do it, the Catholic Church says this, whatever. And it's funny because in the last year, last 2 years maybe, it's the first time I've missed. I'm always one of those every Sunday Catholic, never miss. And I've missed a couple times, and it's funny because it hasn't been this big guilt trip and Catholic guilt and stuff, because there were times when I wanted to sit on the beach and be alone rather than be in a church going.
Well, Jesus said you don't need to go to the synagogue or to the holy mountains to pray.
Yeah, you know. He didn't go to Mass the 40 days. He went to the desert.
Yeah, he said you don't need to do that. Jesus would give you the Sunday off.
Right.
He said go in the closet is what he was saying. It's your own individual relationship.
Right.
Don't go out into the public and say, don't go to the church and say, but one thing that...
If you're interested, I have a couple of Rajneesh discourses on Jesus' teachings that you might like. There's a couple of those, and there's also, like I say, the Prabhuvananda's Sermon on the Mount, which is so delightful.
Right. Because actually somebody who I consider a teacher is Mother Teresa, when you mentioned her just earlier, because all of her and her writings and the books and the way she lived her life is so in line with what I'm learning here.
Yeah.
She was totally into meditation, and she had a real devout worship for the Eucharist, which is where that's kind of what keeps me in Catholicism, because I do have that association with that. But there's so many other things that have been going on with it that I'm like, this is so not what Jesus intended, you know, that show off the mark. You know?
There's a conditioning in the church also. One of my big realizations last year was seeing the Christ consciousness in this smelly, nasty, homeless man. And he was the worst one, you know, if he even existed on the Strand. And when I could see the God consciousness within him, is when I felt more about everybody. And I shared this in my Bible study, and they said, well, Sean, if he was a Christian, he wouldn't be homeless. And I was like, whatever. But I was like, whatever. But then today, this church down the street, my neighbor's a pastor of this Church of Science, and I was telling him about that, and he goes, well, where did Jesus live?
Sure.
Jesus was homeless. And what it was is Jesus went home to his brothers and sisters, and they kicked him out. They were going to throw him off a cliff. They kicked him out. Jesus had nowhere to lay his hat.
Right.
You know. So it was just...
Yeah, the fact is, truth is truth.
Right.
And, 5,000 years ago, the rishis in India wrote the Upanishads, okay? Which are absolutely consistent with the Tao Te Ching that Lao Tzu wrote, which is absolutely consistent with everything Jesus said, which is absolutely consistent with everything Buddha said. Not remotely consistent with most of the commentaries on what these people said, because the minute somebody is writing a commentary, he wants to sell 100,000 copies, so he's got to water it down to where 100,000 people can hear it, and 100,000 people can't hear what Jesus really said. The consciousness has to be at the level to understand that sort of thing. So there's a lot of...
Well, what's often used is John chapter 3, I think it is, but it's, I am the way, the truth, and the life, the only way to the Father is through me, is what a lot of Oriental Christians will say.
Through Christ consciousness.
Yes, yeah. And they say, so therefore you got to be a Christian to go to heaven. And I'm like, I always used to, my response has always been, I don't think Gandhi is in hell. If there is a hell.
Through Christ consciousness.
It's like, there's no way.
The thing you have to realize is that when Robert says I, he's not talking about Robert. He's talking about consciousness. He's talking about being in absolute awareness. And when Jesus says I am the way, I am the truth, I am the light, he's not talking about that body. He's talking about absolute awareness. He's talking about pure consciousness. He's talking about what we call the Christ, which is consciousness, which is synonymous with Buddha mind. That's what he's talking about. Jesus is very aware of the fact that he is the one, like everybody is the one, like all of us are. I mean, Jesus had no doubt that he was the Son of God, and had no doubt that everybody else was, or daughter, as the case may be. I am the one, and it's so clear to me that all of you are too. And we started tonight with, if you would stop thinking that you're the individual personified little personalities, personified I, if you would stop identifying with that, then you too could see that you're the Christ. And of course, once you realize it, then there's no question about what any of these people mean, because it's just as obvious as it can be. But you need to have the realization to remove all doubt. Then there's no question. There can't possibly be any question when you see the truth, because if you're having a dream and you wake up, there is no doubt that you woke up and that it was a dream. Right? Ditto for this one. And that would sound like nonsense to anybody who was in the dream, and it may sound like nonsense to the people here now, but when you wake up, it won't. And that's all I'm saying. Like I was telling Kathy, like I usually tell people, don't believe a word I say. Hear it, understand it, and then go out and find out if it's true. Go have the experience. The practice is to stop identifying with the I and self-inquiry. I'm really glad you mentioned self-inquiry, because that's the short route. Or just refuse to think. Just don't think. Several people around here are playing with a mantra that came to me several weeks ago now, but I've been passing around a bit. That whenever you find yourself worrying about a problem, just say, this does not require my thought. Nothing requires my thought. Just, the minute you catch yourself thinking about something, you say, this does not require my thought. Nothing requires my thought. And that's the second half of that is true. It is true that nothing requires your thought. Although that's a scary position for some people to take. Now there's a good silence here. I'll sit in it for a minute. Anything else?
Yes, we'll be meeting in 2 weeks. Well, I won't be here next week, but we'll be meeting in 2 weeks.
As far as I know. People show up, we'll do it. And we certainly don't take off Tuesdays close to Mother's Day. I still think Mother's Day should be a day of atonement anyway. Don't think it requires celebration. Right, 80% of the cases. Father's Day too, of course.
Equal opportunity.
Equal opportunity. Okay, thanks for coming. I love you all.
Thank you.
And look for you, and I'll show you where those tapes are. Okay.